Welcome to the Podcaster Hour from Ecamm, helping entrepreneurs, business owners, and live streamers launch a podcast with success using the power of Ecamm Live. Grow your audience and expand your reach, and learn how to plan, promote, produce, and repurpose your live show and podcast. Here's your host, Ian Anderson Gray.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Podcaster Hour. It is the Podcaster Hour. This is very exciting. So this show is all about launching your podcast, whether it's from a live show or whether it's just standalone. But obviously, we're going to be focusing on live and how you can launch your podcast from your live show using Ecamm Live, using the power of Ecamm Live. And if you haven't yet discovered Ecamm Live, if you've not played with it, oh my goodness, it is such an amazing tool for launching your podcast, because not only can you use it for live video, it also has an amazing feature that will record the video and the audio particularly on separate tracks, which is amazing for editing. So I'm going to talk you through that on another day. Today, though, I'm really excited to be introducing a good friend of mine, Colin Gray, who is a podcast expert. He is the owner of the Podcast Host. He speaks all around the world on podcasting. Now, he's from Scotland, but last year and this year, he's actually in Australia. In Australia at the moment, it's about 2:30 in the morning, and I thought that would be a little bit nasty of me to get him up at 2:30 in the morning. So today, we've got a bit of a hybrid show. This is exciting, a hybrid show. So I'm live at the moment, and I'm going to be here answering your questions. But the interview I've got with Colin is pre-recorded. We pre-recorded this a few weeks ago, but I will be in the chat. So if you've got any questions for me, I will be answering those in the chat, but also I'll be able to answer some questions when I get back after the interview. It's split into two parts. Let's see. We've also got Anthony saying, been thinking of starting one for a very long time. Now, Anthony, I don't know whether you caught the first episode of the Podcaster Hour. If you can go back, probably best on the YouTube channel, go back and watch episode 1, because I do talk about procrastination. We do talk about mindset and also how you plan, because I think that was the big thing for me that clinched it. I procrastinated for years, and it wasn't until I actually put a plan in place that allowed me to actually start podcasting. And you're in for a treat today, Anthony. In today's interview with Colin, we do talk about planning. We do talk about mindset as well. So I think you're going to find this really helpful. Katie says, I started 2 podcasts and abandoned them, thinking of restarting one of them. That's a really interesting point, Katie. I wonder how many of you watching have had a podcast and have abandoned them. I have. I'm the same. So I had a podcast about 8 or 9 years ago, and I think I got up to episode 25, and then I gave up. So yeah. Okay, keep the questions coming. In today's show, as I said, Colin Gray is my guest today. He is from Scotland originally, but he is in Australia at the moment. So this is pre-recorded, but I'm going to be in the chat answering your questions. So do keep them coming. If you do have a question that you would like me to answer, I can't promise I'll get through all of them, but if you could preface the comment with a Q, capital Q, and then a colon, that will just make it a lot easier for me. So without further ado, it's time to introduce you to Colin. Here we go. So I'm excited to be joined today by Colin Gray, all the way from Australia. And Colin, you're not from Australia, are you?
No, as you can probably tell by the accent. No, I'm not. I'm just a passing visitor right now.
You're a passing visitor. You're obviously from the UK, from Scotland. And this is why we're pre-recording this segment, because 4 p.m. UK time in Australia is like 2 in the morning or something mad like that? 3 in the morning.
Yeah, I'm adding an hour and a half to my time and then inverting the clock. So it's almost 12 hours. It's almost exactly opposite.
Yeah.
It's a pain.
Yeah. So yeah, we wouldn't want that for you. We want you to have some sleep. So we've known each other for quite some time. We met, I think, at New Media Europe, which is a conference that happened in the UK. We've also known each other from Upreneur, which is another conference in the UK. So yeah, just maybe tell people who haven't come across you before a little bit more about you, how you got into podcasting as well. Would be great to know.
Yeah, sure. My story goes back to one of my original jobs. I've had a lot of jobs over my time, but for a while I was a learning technologist, which basically means helping lecturers learn how to teach better with technology. So how to use technology to help their students. And one of the fancy fashionable learning texts back in 2007, 2008 was podcasting, funnily enough. It kind of came up, and it'd been out for a few years before that, but it had come to the attention of the university I worked for. So I was told, as the resident learning tech, to figure out how this whole thing worked. So it was like, oh, podcasting sounds interesting. Okay, started listening, started learning how it worked. And I kind of just fell in love with the medium back at the time, partly as a listener. Like I just love the medium because it meant that I always worked in front of my desk and I loved to get out for a walk, like for an hour at lunchtime. And it meant that I had something to do while I was on that walk. I could listen and learn and be entertained at the time. And partly because I just love the feeling of speaking into a microphone and how personal it is. It's very different from video, I find. It's just very personal. It's very intimate. It feels more one-to-one, like you're speaking to just one person. I just loved that process. And so my story went on from there. I started teaching a course at the university, helping lecturers learn how to do it. I started a blog around podcasting because I was loving it so much at the time. I just wanted to teach other people how to do it. And that blog essentially turned into, over about 9 or 10 years, into the business I run today. Just started earning a bit of an affiliate income, and then I earned enough that I could quit my job, and I took on some staff. And nowadays we have a whole range of courses on podcasting. We have a piece of software that helps people run a podcast called Alitu. And I get to spend all day every day basically either teaching or doing podcasting or creating some kind of content related to it, which I find myself very lucky every single day.
Oh, that sounds awesome. And I love what you said about the intimacy of podcasting, because I think you're so right. There's nothing else quite like it, that people will effectively plug you into their ears and listen for like more than 5 minutes, more than 5 seconds. They will actually listen. Yeah. And, I was talking about this recently about the different audiences. Live video is very intimate, I think. It's very authentic. And you've got those two audiences. You've got your live audience and your replay audience. But I think the feeling is there. It's more of speaking to lots of people. You've got a big audience. You've got a big community there. Whereas with podcasting, it's even more intimate. You're speaking to one person. And so just before we get stuck into the podcasting 101 thing, I just love your take really on when you're speaking on a podcast, in your mind, you're thinking you're speaking to one person. I assume that's what you're thinking about. It's a bit more complicated if we're doing a live video and then repurposing that into a podcast, because for the live video, you're thinking about speaking to a community of people. And on the podcast part, you're speaking to one person. How do we, muddle around that in our brains?
I would argue that just about any kind of medium that you're creating, whatever it is, you should be speaking to just one person. That personal connection is what you're looking for, whether it's a live video, whether it's YouTube, whether it's a blog post you're writing to somebody. As soon as you say on a podcast, on a video, whatever it is, everyone out there, my whole audience, this is what I want to tell you all. As soon as you say that, you lose a little bit of that personal connection. And I think even if somebody's watching a live video, they know other people are watching as well, but there's something special about you just say individually. So you, my listener, you, the person listening, speaking individually, there's something quite meaningful about that. So I tend to think of your ideal audience, thinking about your audience avatar, that persona that you're speaking to every time, and really speaking directly to them every single time. That's how I tend to translate it. I think I'm speaking into this microphone, but it's coming out on one person on the other end. And I always think about it that way. And I just find that gives me more of a connection to them, which makes my content more authentic, but it makes it more authentic to them as well. Does that make sense with a live audience, or do you think it's different?
Yeah, I think it does. And I really like what you said there. I think different people have said different things to me, but I do love the feeling of speaking to one person. But I think everyone knows, if you're watching a live show, everyone knows there's more than one person watching. And I think when you're listening, you know that more than one person's listening. So I think it's great to have that kind of community feeling, but you can still speak to that one person whilst having that. Yeah. It's just a bit of a juggling act, I think.
Yeah, I believe so. I think you can have that impression. That's how you want the person to feel, and they will feel it, even though they know it's not a fact. People feel that because it's your voice speaking into their head, whether it's headphones in a live audience or podcast, whichever way. I think it works.
No, that's great. So it's just to say, if you are going to be producing a podcast from a live show, there's just a few more things, obviously, to think about. We're going to be talking about that. So your website is, have I got it right, thepodcasthost.com? Is that right?
Thepodcasthost.com. Yes, exactly.
Excellent. I'm glad I got that right. So on that, you've got loads of resources, everything to do with podcasting, including microphones, of course, but it's not all about the gear. In fact, I've heard you speak recently at an event we were both involved with. This is one of the things you were saying, that when we all tend to get overly excited by the gear. Now, which microphone? You've got this big, beautiful microphone in front of you. And I could be very tempted to ask you what microphone you're using, which I will do, but not yet. We're getting started with podcasting. Now, whether we're repurposing from a live show into a podcast or whether we're just doing a podcast, what are the things that we need to think about right from the start?
It's got to be the content first. It's got to be about the content first, rather than the gear, rather than the equipment, the software, all that stuff. And like you say, everyone jumps into the gear first because it's the most obvious part. It's the part that a lot of people get intimidated by. But we can talk about that. We can answer that question, no worries. But the most important, and the only way you're going to make your podcast grow, the only way you're going to make a successful show and find an audience, is if you have a problem that you're going to solve for a very specific audience and figure out exactly how you are going to solve that for them in a unique way. And that's the triplet for me. That's the three things that we tend to talk through. So, problem first. What is the problem you're solving for this audience? Now, for a lot of people, this is quite obvious. You know, if you're teaching a subject, if you're like a marketing coach, then maybe it's get more leads. If you're a health coach, maybe it's lose weight. Even if it's something more entertainment based, I'm going to teach you how to play Dungeons and Dragons more effectively. So we're going to talk about the rules every week. The problem still is, I don't know how to play this very well. I want to find out how to play it more effectively. So everything from work stuff through to fun stuff, it tends to be most effective if you have a really specific problem that you can solve for people. Because let's face it, people are generally selfish, whether we like to admit it or not. We want to know we're going to get something for ourselves out of the time we put into this show. Whether it's learning something, whether it's inspiration, whether it's just entertainment. You know, maybe the problem is I'm bored for half an hour and I want my favorite presenter to make me laugh, something like that. But the problem is really important. Now, the solution is generally relatively obvious. It's whatever you teach, it's your knowledge, it's your experience. So the solution, you tell the person how you're going to solve it for them. But the bit that a lot of people miss, I think, is the uniqueness. Like, how are you most uniquely served to solve this problem, or how are you most uniquely served to give a solution to the listener? And that's something really worth thinking through. There's a load of different ways that you can be unique. Whether it's an angle you take on a subject, knitting for men, or maybe it's politics for school kids, or maybe it's more a kind of niche of that subject. So maybe it's politics for Scottish politics, or maybe instead of just cycling, it's mountain biking, a small subsection of that. So angles, it could be niches, or it could be something like format or audio quality. Maybe your format, you're going to do an interview in the middle, but then you're going to actually have a quiz for that interviewee at the end. That's a special segment, and then a bit of news as well. It can be how you put your show together as well. But there's lots of different ways that you can make your show unique. That's the important thing, I think, is thinking through those three things to figure out exactly what your show is going to offer and really make it really worthwhile for somebody to listen.
Yeah, I love that. You can almost never get too niche. Maybe you can, but I think we tend to think more general, but actually get a little bit more niche. I'm going to ask you, Colin.
Yeah.
Are you a Dungeons and Dragons fan, just out of interest?
I give that away, didn't I? A little bit.
I've never played myself, but it's the kind of thing that I probably would do if I had my life again.
Oh, I'll bring you into that later on, Ian. We'll talk about that after the show.
Okay, we'll talk about that later. So moving on, how do we do all of that? Because one of the reasons I think why so many of us go towards the gear, yes, it can be intimidating, but it's almost a little bit easier. You can ask a friend, what's the best microphone? And they say, get the Mega Microphone 5000 Mark II, and you get it, and it's amazing. But you've just asked us to find out our niche and to find out our audience and all this kind of stuff. And it's a little bit more out there. I'm sure you've worked with many clients all around the world on this kind of thing. How do you go about doing that research and getting all that done? Have you got any tips for us?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's exactly why folks skip it, because it's hard. It's difficult. And you have to spend a fair bit of time doing it. Some people spend a couple hours figuring that stuff out. Some people spend days. And it ties in then to what the name of the show is going to be, which is always the nightmare that folks spend way too long thinking about. But I often think it's down to thinking about the questions that people ask you most often. So if you're going to start a podcast on something, usually you are into that subject anyway. There's some unique cases maybe where you're doing it for a client or a company or something, and it's maybe not quite so relevant, but usually it's something that's a passion for you. You're a big advocate of, and therefore folk will be asking you questions about it. Folk will know you're into it. Maybe you're already coaching it. Maybe you're already talking to friends about it. You're part of a club. Folk will ask you questions about it. So think through, what are the most common questions people ask you about your subject? So going back to the previous example, Ian, what do people ask us most about? It's what mic should I buy? So we can do a whole season about gear. We could do a whole season about gear on our podcast. And this is the thing that I think frees up a lot of people actually. It's the idea that you can go for a really specific niche. So that really common question, think about that most common question in your area and think about that as the initial subject for your podcast. But it might just be the initial subject for the first season. Do 8, 10, 12 episodes on equipment, podcast equipment. Here's the season around how to choose the best podcast equipment. We'll do one episode on mics, one episode on mixers, one episode on recorders, and we'll go through all the different choices. And then you cover that over 10, 12 episodes, something like that. Doesn't mean you have to stick with that forever. Because at that point, at the end of that first run, you then ask your initial audience, what did you enjoy about this? What did you like? What do you want to know next? What's the next most common question? And then you expand out to that. So often what you'll find is podcasters will start with something super niche, super specific. Partly because it's easier to plan, and also partly because it makes it much easier to sell to your audience. Because if it's super specific, 10 episodes answering a really specific question, anybody that finds it, they know right away whether this show is for them. It's a no-brainer whether they should listen or not. So it's a really good idea to go that super specific. But you'll find that they will expand out over time. They'll cover another area, another niche. And in the end, it'll be a podcast about the whole of the podcasting industry in our case. And that applies to loads of different markets. So yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it at least.
No, that's great. And so you mentioned the idea of having seasons. There are two ways of doing it. You could go episode 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to wherever you get to, or you can do it in seasons. Do you want to just explain to people watching or listening the way those different formats can work and why you would choose one over the other?
So what seasons versus a normal just week by week podcast?
Yeah.
I'm a big advocate of seasons, actually. I think that generally for most podcasts, it's a really good way to start. So there's a few different reasons around that. One is around you as the podcaster, making it easier for you. Because if you think about it, a season is really it's like a TV season. So a series, you're planning out a finite thing. I often think in 8 or 12 because that's 2 or 3 months worth of content. So 8 episodes would be 2 months of weekly content. So let's say it's 12. You're doing a 3-month run initially, and you plan out 12 episodes that matches that most common question you're asked. One of the biggest barriers to new podcasters is often that commitment in the early days. You're really enthusiastic in those first few episodes, but then suddenly you're in it and you're like 2, 3, 4 weeks in and you're like, okay, so I've got another one to plan. It's next week. It's Monday. I've got another episode. I'm committed to this forever. I'm like, I've got to do this every week forever. And it's too intimidating. But if you think of it as a season, it's a finite chunk of stuff. You can plan out 12 episodes, all of which tie together. And it's really easy to plan as well, because you just think of that overall subject that the season covers. Like I mentioned, an example being the podcast equipment, plan out mics, mixers, recorders, blah, blah, blah. I've got my 12 episodes planned out. You can do that in 20 minutes, 30 minutes, have it all planned out ahead of time. And then that's it. That's 3 months worth of content planned. So the workflow is really simple, really straightforward, because then you can record in batches, but you can record 4 episodes at a time because you've planned so far ahead. And the benefits on top of that as well are also for your listeners. So it actually really helps listeners when you plan it out in this way, because as soon as you have an organized season of, say, 12 episodes, each episode leads into the next. You're building that knowledge episode to episode. And you compare that to the traditional method of podcasting or general content creation, which is this week I'm going to talk about beginner's level in this area. Next week I'm going to talk about an advanced subject in this other area over here. And it's like sending somebody off to study maths at university, and one day they get addition, and then the next day they get general relativity or Schrodinger's theory. It's ridiculous the way we think about it that way. Whereas with a season, they're going idea to idea, scaffolding, building. And by the end of the season, every episode's built on the next. And they've really learned something step by step with you holding their hand through it. And that just generates so much success. It generates so much trust. It generates real action. And it generates loyal listeners because people want to listen to every episode because they're connected, because it's meaningful. Listen to the next one built on the last one, so they can't skip. So there's a bunch of benefits in there for you can tell I like them, can't you, Ian? Like I tell everyone to do seasons.
I do. I suppose you could have seasons within a normal episodic kind of structure. So you could say the next 4 episodes are going to be on knitting for men, and then the next ones are going to be on Dungeons and Dragons. Not a good idea, by the way, but you could do it that way. I think that's great. And we'll talk a little bit more about how you can actually create or choose between seasons and the episodic thing. That's when we talk about the gear and the tech and all that kind of things. And I would like to talk to you about mindset as well, because I think there is that struggle when we don't know what the episode is. But before that, I just wanted to ask you, we've got that choice between episodical themes, and we've got an idea of who our audience is now, and we know what we're talking about. The other question is, this is a question also if you do a live show or a podcast. Do we go for all solo episodes, or all having a guest or having a co-host, or do we do a mixture? What's your take on that, and how do we make that choice?
So this is one of the things I love most about podcasting, and it's the question you always get, which are something like exactly what you've just asked. So what format should I follow? How long should my podcast be? How often should I do my podcast? And all these are great questions. Like, they're good questions to be thinking about. But the great answer is you can do whatever the heck you like. It's totally open. Like, podcasting is so good in that you can just do what you want to do. And because you're going to find your own audience and your own voice and solving your own problems, you will find people that love the way you go about it. Sorry, to answer not to avoid it, but to actually answer your question. I think, and this is not the right answer for everyone, my experience has led me to believe that listeners do like to know what to expect in most ways. So they like to have an average episode. So they'll know that this show is generally a co-hosted show. It's 2 pals that talk every week and they catch up. Every second or third episode, they'll have an interview. They'll bring somebody else in. And then every 7th or 8th episode, one of them will just do a show by themselves where they'll just rant about something, and it'll be quite funny or quite educational or whatever it'll be. But then they'll come back to co-hosting the week after. It can be a mix, but with an average of a certain type of format. That's what I think works well. I think that even though you have the power to change it every single week, I think that the changing every single week, not having that average, that expectation can be a little bit confusing.
That's really good. I hadn't thought about it that way. So for my show, I do solo episodes and guest episodes. I find it a lot easier, obviously, when you have a guest, because it's like having a conversation. I need to work harder if it's just me. But I hadn't thought about getting like a rhythm of different ones. And that's a bit tricky, I think, but it's definitely something to think about. Now, mindset side of things, I think I've talked about this before. I knew this was going to happen when I got to about episode, I can't remember what it was for me, maybe episode 20, 21, 22. I got the blues, and I felt like my downloads wasn't enough, and I felt like nobody loved me, and I was going to cry. And then thankfully, about 3 or 4 weeks later, I went to a conference and I bumped into loads of people who said, "Oh, Ian, I love your podcast." And I was thinking to myself, why didn't you tell me this 3 weeks ago when I was feeling down? So how can we keep going when we have those tough moments, when we feel that we're not getting the growth that we want to?
Yeah. And interesting question. Like, what were your expectations then, Ian, when you started yours? Why do you think you got those blues? Why did you not think it was enough?
It wasn't logical. And actually, the numbers were pretty good. But I was probably comparing myself with, I don't know what I was comparing myself with, but I don't know. I think it's easy to go through those stages and think maybe it's not enough. And the other thing is that, particularly for podcasting, you don't get so many of those comments. You don't get comments. You don't get people so much emailing you in, particularly at the start. I don't know if you're familiar with the whole love languages thing. I need those words of affirmation. I need people to say to me, "Ian, that's great." And I wasn't getting that at the beginning. So,
there's a couple of really interesting things in there. I think the reason I asked that was because I think a lot of people do have very unrealistic unrealistic expectations when it comes to podcasting. And there's two parts in that. The one part is that it's important to know that podcasting is a much smaller medium in general than others. So if you've been running a blog for a while already, if you've been running even a YouTube channel, something like that, which many people out there might have been doing if you're thinking about doing a podcast, you can't compare blog readers to podcast listeners, because you might have 10,000 blog readers and that's not actually very much, but then 1,000 podcast listeners is actually quite a lot. Now, I'll find the stats. I'll be able to bring them up in front of me because I remember they came up just recently, actually, when I was talking to Matthew, who's on my team. So I'll pop that up in the background while we're doing it. But I can tell you exactly what the stats are in terms of what the averages are, and you'll be surprised at how small they are. Have you come across these before, Ian?
No, I haven't. I'm very
average listen numbers. Yeah. If you look at, so I'm bringing them up right now. If you are above, so this is number of listens in the first 7 days. So if you get more than 229 listens in the first 7 days, in the first week, so 229 people, that doesn't sound like a big number. But if you get more than 229 listens in the first days, you're in the top 10% of all podcasts. This is as measured by Buzzsprout, which is one of the podcast hosts. If you get more than 500, you're in the top 5%. And if you get more than 3,000, you're in the top 1%. So if you want to compare yourself, then it's good to have these realistic numbers. So if you get above 200, then you're doing well. You're already in the top 10%, because a lot of podcasts get less than that. Now, that might sound discouraging because you're thinking, oh, it's quite hard to get up to that kind of numbers. But there's something really important to know is, again, comparing blog readers to podcast listeners. The thing is, podcasting is such a much more trust-based, engagement-based medium that one podcast listener, if you're talking about just action, if you're talking about engagement, one podcast listener is worth 1,000 blog readers, I would say. If I'm trying to get somebody to do something by publishing a blog post, if I ask somebody to click a button at the bottom of that blog post, take an action, I'll get like 0.1% people will do that. So 1 in 1,000 people or something like that will do it, max. But if I have 200 podcast listeners that are listening every week loyally, they're listening to half an hour of my voice, they're getting to know me really well, really personally, because they're listening to my voice every week, I'm giving them a ton of value. If I have 200 listeners, 100 of those people might take action on what I ask them to do, like 50% of them. So that's what I mean. Podcasting is much smaller numbers generally than the other mediums, but it's so much higher action and so much higher engagement. So that maybe helps with part of it, does it, Ian?
That makes me feel a lot better, thank you. And so it's really helpful to have those stats. Yeah, you're going to say.
Sorry, I was just going to say the other side to it is you need to ask a lot more with podcasting as well. Like, I think put your voice out there and ask for feedback every single week. That's one of the best calls to action you can put in your show for the first 10 to 20 episodes to me. Are you enjoying this show? Am I giving you what you want? What do you want to hear more of? What do you want to hear less of? Tell me what you like. Tell me what you don't like. Get back to me and make it really specific. Tweet me at this in the next 5 minutes and tell me an answer to this question. What do you want to hear more of? That kind of stuff. Make it really specific what you want people to do. And that is one of the greatest ways to grow your show, because you'll find out what people want more of. You'll find out what questions they're asking. You'll be able to tailor your show to those listeners, but it'll also give you that mindset boost. It'll show you there's people out there listening, enjoying what you do, and that'll keep you going through the hard times.
Well, that is great advice. Thank you, Colin. If you've got any questions for myself or for Colin, do put that in the comments. I'm going to just leave you. I'm going to come back to you, Colin, in a little bit. I'm going to answer some questions in the comments, and we're going to talk about tech and actually how to get your podcast launched just after this. Wow, so many things there from Colin. I'd love to know, did you enjoy that? The first section of the interview I did with Colin. Now, if you just joined, or if you joined partway through that was pre-recorded, because Colin Gray, he normally lives in Scotland. He's actually in Australia this year, and this would be like 2:30 in the morning. So I pre-recorded that interview. I was live there in the chat, trying to reply to as many of you as possible. Maria Allen asked loads of really good questions, but the first question she asked was, do you use Ecamm for your podcasts? And yeah, I do. So one of the things that I'm a massive advocate of is starting off your podcast, in fact, all the content that you create with a live show. Because yes, there's all the tech involved and all that kind of stuff. But once you set up the tech, and the tech is not that difficult, once you set it up, it really punches through that perfectionism and that procrastination. It's a great way to create that content and engage with your live audience, build community. Community is a big word for me. So you do that. And the great thing about it is if you use Ecamm Live, it gives you the ability to save the video recording, but also save the audio recording. And in the latest version of Ecamm, you've got the ability to split the tracks. If you're interviewing a guest, your audio will be on a separate audio file to your guests. And that just makes it so much easier to then edit your podcast for later. For example, if you have a coughing fit halfway through, that's not going to come through on the guest track. So it's a lot easier to edit out. So I'm a massive fan of using Ecamm Live when it comes to that. Now, we had a question from Anthony. So let me just put this up on the screen. So Anthony says, so if you're speaking to one person, which is tremendous clarity, then repurposing a video podcast is very different. Your thoughts? So this is great. I did cover this briefly in a previous show, which is actually when you do a live show that becomes a podcast, you've actually got 3 different audiences to think about. With live, you've got your replay viewers. These are the people in the future that you've got to think about. So you don't want to focus so much on your live viewers that it becomes boring for your replay audience. But you've also got to think about your live audience. It's important to make your live audience feel loved. And so I can answer your question now, but then you also want to think about your podcast listener as well. And so the way I think about it is I think it's a great idea to think of the one person. So for example, Anthony, I'm talking to you right now. You are that one person. I'm also thinking about my ideal viewer and listener to this show. And if this was a podcast, it would be the same. So think about it as one person, but you still want to have that kind of community feel to it. So focus on that one person, but you can have a bit of a party community aspect to it as well. I hope that helps. So Maria Allen says, are all of your podcasts a straight Q&A? I love podcasts that have a storytelling / journalistic style. Magazine editor by trade, but I'm aware that style of podcast requires more editing. And I hope you heard what Colin said, Maria. He basically said, you can do what you want. And this is the great thing. Yet you've got to do a format that's going to work for you. And you did talk about the idea of not wanting to edit it so much, or that the journalistic storytelling side of things might require more editing. Well, not necessarily. If you keep practicing it, you will not need to do so much editing. And actually, I think sometimes a slightly less edited website is more real, and it's what people are wanting. I edit my podcast episodes far less than I did at the start. And that's probably because I'm not doing the whole perfectionism thing so much. People actually just want real. And so, yes, you might want to edit a few things. You stumble over words or you make mistakes, but don't spend too long on that. And now let's see what the next one was. Live for Wonder says, my barrier is simply that I'm working on creating my site and blog first. I have the equipment, the topics, etc., but working on getting the back end set up. And yeah, I totally empathize with this. There's only so many hours in the day. You can't spend all your time flitting about everything. You do need to focus on one thing at a time, but you do want to think about growing your audience as well. What's going to happen once you've created your blog and your website? If you have a live show or a podcast, you can be working on growing your audience now so that when your site is ready, you can send your audience to them. I know what you mean, but I think you should just get on and do it. And it doesn't need to be perfect. So I hope that helps. Melissa was talking about accents and stuff. And I think you were worried about your accent not being attractive to people. And I was just saying to you, Melissa, just be you. Your accent might not be everyone's cup of tea. I've heard you speak. I think your accent is absolutely fine. But it's just about being you. Just be you. It's exactly what your perfect audience are going to want. Anthony says, some of us are taking years figuring things out. And I was like that too. Listen to and watch episode 1 because I talk all about that and just having a plan. Okay, so what was the next question? Let's have a look. Oh, there we go. Colin talked about the differences between doing a seasonal podcast or show and an episodic one. And Colin's a big fan of doing it in seasons or, series. Tobias asks, but are seasons meant by Colin also in a thematic way, not also in thinking of producing for the next 3 months? Yeah, so I don't know if you picked up on this, Tobias, but I said the traditional way of seasons is to do one season and then stop. And that season's on a specific thing. Then you stop and then you reboot it with season 2, which is something else. So you could do that. That's a really good way of doing it. And that's what Colin likes. I've got something a little bit more like what you're talking about, which is I have themes. I have a thematic one. So I have 3 different themes for my shows. I do mindset and confidence. That's the theme number 1. Then theme number 2 is the tech and gear. And theme number 3 is content and marketing. And each show will be on one of those themes. So you could do that. You could mix it. Every single episode is going to be a different theme. Or you could say, for the next 5 episodes, I'm going to do this theme. The next 5 episodes after that, another theme. And that's episodic, but it's thematic. But I think what Colin was saying is you commit for, say, 10 or 12 episodes, and that is going to be one season, and then you reboot it afterwards. And there's pros and cons with either one. I personally prefer episodic. Colin prefers the season side of things. It's really up to you. Nancy, great question. How do you decide what to name your episode? So I talked about this on the first show. So if you watch episode 1, I come up with a plan. So I think if you come up with themes for your shows, whether it's going to be in a season or whether it's episodic, doesn't matter. But think of those different themes, and that's going to make it so much easier for you to come up with the episode title. What's it going to be about? Look at what other people are out there are asking question-wise. A great way is to answer a clients or your audience's questions. So I do this a lot. For example, today talking about podcasting. So it could be your top questions answered, or your top podcast questions answered, or how to launch your live show, or how to launch your podcast. I don't know what it is that you do, Nancy, but that's just something to think about. And Michael says, tag episode number and the main topic of the episode is the way to go. SPPD 420 interview with. Now that's an interesting one. That definitely used to be the case, Michael. And I'm not saying don't do that, but things have changed slightly now, particularly with Apple Podcasts. They actually recommend not to put the episode number in the title because you can now tag the number in Apple Podcasts. So I'll talk about this in a future episode, but you don't have to do that anymore. And I actually prefer personally not to do that because then when people share it out, it doesn't look so exciting if it has the episode number in there. I just want to go straight in with the title in there. So that's my view, but feel free to just disagree with that one. Maria Allen's thinking about niche podcasts. What do you think about regional content, meaning topics that highlight guests and stories related to a specific geographical region? Is that too limiting as far as podcast audience? So I suppose it is, are you thinking about doing like a whole podcast on a specific region? And is it targeting that particular region? Or are you going to do different regions each week? I think if you're going to do a different geographical region each week, I think your audience will still probably be interested in learning more about those specific regions. Depends on the topic of your podcast, and maybe think about that. Let me know a little bit more about that, and I'll answer that question a little bit more fully. And Anthony says, how much is our experience in plateauing about personal development? Yeah, I think it is. I think it's partly about that. It's partly to do with your own confidence and your own mindset journey. That was definitely the case for me. I was struggling with confidence, I think, at the time. And I think also with podcasting, you get far less of the comments. This is the great thing about live. I'm getting loads of comments, but podcasting, it's a bit more of a lonely business because it's more of an intimate experience, people plugging you into their ears. But I do agree with you there. I'm going to get on with the next part of the interview. Keep those questions coming. We'll have a little short time at the end. I'll be able to go through those too. So I'll see you live after this. But here is the second part of the interview with Colin. Wonderful. Thank you, Colin, for this time. I know it's getting a little bit late in Australia, but thank you for that. So we now need to talk about the bit that everyone's been waiting for, the tech and the gear. So what do we... Yeah, the shiny stuff. So what do we need? We obviously need to spend $10,000 on the state-of-the-art studio with a mega microphone and acoustic paneling. Tell us how we get started.
Well, one thing, just a USB mic, is it? Like literally just buy a good USB mic, and that is all you really need for podcasting. To give some recommendations, there's a couple I like the best. There's one called the Samson Q2U. So that's Samson rather than Samsung. Ian's got one right in front of him there, which is great. It's such a good little USB mic, and it only costs, if you're in the UK, it's about £50, £60. If you're in the US, it's about $70, $80. And it's great quality. It's handheld. It goes in a little stand. It comes with a stand, in fact, and it plugs directly into your computer. So you can record online calls. You can record solo segments. You can do all of those kind of normal ways of recording a podcast. And even better, it actually has an XLR connection in it too, which is the professional music equipment format, really, which lets you plug it into a recorder, it lets you plug it into a mixer. So if you do want to complicate your setup later and buy some more fancy stuff, you don't grow out of it. The Samsung Q2U will grow with you.
That's great. And that is a USB microphone. It's got XLR as well, so you can get fancy later. And that, am I right in saying, is a dynamic microphone? Why would you recommend a dynamic microphone over, say, there are other types of microphones like condenser microphones, there's shotgun microphones, lapel mics. Why particularly that kind of microphone?
Yeah, you're looking for a dynamic mic really as a podcast, as an amateur podcaster, because we tend to record noisy ones. So a condenser microphone, the benefits of a condenser is that it tends to pick up more sound, more deep, rich sounds, which are great in a silent studio. If you've got no noise around you, you've got no reverb, you've got a fully soundproofed, sound treated, everything room. It sounds amazing. Then that's great for a condenser. But most of us are recording in pretty standard like office rooms like this. I mean, I've got a wee bit of treatment on the walls, but even here, I still use a dynamic mic, which is the Rode Podcaster in front of me. Yeah, the dynamic mic picks up a little bit less sound, a little bit less gain, just as deep, really. I mean, you still sound good, but it'll just pick up a little bit less of that background noise, that reverb, that hiss is good.
So you've got what was the Rode? What is it? A Rode?
The Samsung Q2U is great quality, but the Rode Podcaster is the one in front of me, Rode Podcaster. And it's a USB mic only, plugs right into your computer. It is bigger, it's more bulky, doesn't come with a stand, so you do need to buy a boom arm as well. So I've got the Rode PSA-1 boom arm here. So the two of them together, plus the shock mount here, which the mic is plugged into, costs around, I think you're probably talking about £300 to £350 all in. Maybe something like $400, $450. So a lot more expensive, but it does sound really nice. It is definitely a step up from the...
It looks nice. And you've got in there, you've also got a shock mount as well, which presumably that's to get rid of any of those knocks and bumps that you might have as well.
Protects it from the desk bashes and stuff like that.
Yeah. So if you're a desk basher, that might be something you want to think about. So we've got a microphone, we've plugged it in, and one of the things that I have talked about on the show is how you can actually record it. So if you're using Ecamm Live, there's a new feature that allows you to save the audio files of your guest and you separately, which is amazing. And all your sound effects and music are all on different channels. So we've got all of that done. And what is the next stage? We need to obviously edit that together. How do we edit all of those things together? And then how do we make that into actual podcast that people can subscribe to?
So the editing part, it's probably the most complicated part of it. There's nothing too complicated about podcasting, but editing, there's a few things in there that you could do. Do you know, in all honesty, in the early days, try and keep the editing as light as you can. Like, don't take out all your ums and your ahs. Don't do a ton of sound processing and equalization and compression and all that kind of stuff. Not just because it's hard to learn and it takes a while to learn, but just because it keeps your workflow light. And the more time you spend doing that, the less time you're spending planning good content and really perfecting your presentation skills. And that's the stuff that matters. But to do your editing, you can go anything from free tools up to paid tools. One free tool that we recommend a lot is Audacity. So Audacity is a free editing tool that you can record in and you can edit in. It helps you piece all your bits together, add your music in, do all the compression, EQ, all that stuff as well. It's a bit old-fashioned and clunky these days, but it's free, so you can't really complain. And it does well. It's a decent tool. The other two options are, one of them is Audition. So Audition is part of the Adobe Creative Suite. It's definitely more slick, more modern. It costs about $25 a month, I believe, at the moment. There's a fair learning curve in there. There's a lot of tools in there, but it's professional level kit. So if you want to learn how to do good editing and stuff like that, then it's a good tool to use. And the other one, description of our tool. So we have a tool called Alitu, which is designed to do this very thing as well. So Alitu is an editing and production tool, but it handles a whole bunch of it for you. So it does all of the processing, it does the noise reduction, the dynamic leveling. It joins together those separate files. So you can take your Ecamm recordings, level out yours, Ian's, and mine separately, and then stick them together at the end. It'll add the music at the start and the end, and it'll let you put all your segments together, edit them, and actually spit out the finished MP3 at the other end that you can then upload to your hosting as well.
That's really exciting stuff. So definitely check that out. That's alitu.com, isn't it?
That's right, yeah.
That's awesome. So we've now got that MP3, and that's important that we have that. What do we then do? Do we then email it out to all our potential listeners? Is that a podcast? What? tell us what we do next.
You've got a thing called podcast hosting. So podcast hosting is something that intimidates people. It's similar to equipment, but you don't have to worry about it because it's really simple these days. Podcast hosts have become brilliant nowadays. So podcast host is nothing more than essentially a site which hosts your audio files and creates the method by which people can subscribe to your show. So it's called an RSS feed, but you don't need to know how that works. You don't need to even need to know what that is. All you need to know is that you create your episodes on your podcast host, similar to the way you'd create a blog post in WordPress, for example, and then that is published to the web. And those hosts as well generally can handle the distribution for you. So they can handle sending it off to iTunes, sending it to Spotify, sending it to TuneIn Radio. And you don't need to upload anything to iTunes, to Apple Podcasts, to Google Podcasts, to any of these places. They are just directories which draw from the listing of all your episodes, which is kept at the podcast hosting websites. So podcast hosting, really, it's just like your web hosting, but it's where your audio files live, and it's where people download your audio files from when they're listening to your show.
That's great. And have you got any recommendations? I mean, there are loads of these. So what would you recommend?
Yeah, there's a lot out there. There's two I'd recommend, actually. So there's one called Buzzsprout, which is probably the simplest and easiest and lowest cost way to get it out there. They're really good quality. They're good tools, low cost. You can do one show with them for about $12. The other, if you want a bit more power, more sort of growth tools, the ability to make as many podcasts as you want on the one account as well. And that's called Captivate. So Captivate's run by a friend of ours, actually, isn't it? Mark Asquith, and his team. And it's a really good tool. It's one of the best hosts out there. So it's not even a recommendation of a friend. It's genuinely one of the best hosts these days. So that's a bit more expensive, but it's still only $19. So it's not exactly a whole lot more. But yeah, I'd look at those two as the first options.
That's great. And I have to ask you this because I know people will probably ask this question, which is Anchor is another option. I believe that's free. What's your view on that?
Anchor's a funny one because it is free, absolutely. But what's the saying? Is it something like if you're not paying for it, then you're the product. So they're making money out of your podcast, essentially. So you lose a lot of control by going with Anchor because it's reportedly quite hard to move away from them later. You don't get much in the way of website options. They own your RSS feed. In fact, they own your listing with Apple Podcasts as well. So you lose some of those stats that you tend to get from Apple Podcasts. It's certainly not a bad way to start out. If you're just dabbling with podcasting, then certainly start a show on Anchor, play around with it. But generally, if people start to get serious about it, they want the more serious tools, they want the better stats, they want a bit more control over their show, a bit more ownership over their show, and tend to move away to one of the other hosts. So it's up to you whether you want to start free and move later, or just start with the full-on tools at the start. So it's a hard choice, but I'd argue if you're planning to make something out of your podcast long-term, or if it's a business show or something like that, then best to start with a paid one, I would say.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. So we're almost out of time, but of course, at this point, you've published it onto your host and it's time to just go to bed and relax. But of course, it isn't that. How do we then promote and get more listeners to our podcast? How do we actually then promote that more?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of ways to do it. And in fact, we just brought out this very recently. So a book called Podcast Growth with 80 plus ways to grow your podcast. I'll say a couple of things. So some of my favorite ways to grow a podcast are the unscalable ones. So things like it's going back to the value of a podcast listener, the fact that one podcast listener is worth a whole lot. And word of mouth tends to be really important in podcasting. Because of the barriers of listening, we love a lot about podcasting. It's such a great medium. But one of the downsides is that it tends to be harder to get somebody to listen to your show than it would be, read a blog post or something. So people can't just jump onto a blog post, have a quick skim and jump away. They need to actually subscribe to your show in a specific app. They need to download it. They need to listen to half an hour of the show just to get to know you a bit. So it's higher barrier. And that's why that word of mouth recommendation is so important. Getting to know people, those unscalable ways. So, for example, one it is going to events. I love events as a way to promote a podcast. It's not something you would use to grow a blog because you go to an event, you meet 50 people, 50 new blog readers, useless, but 50 new podcast listeners actually can make a huge difference. That's quite a large number. Then they'll listen, they'll get to know, get to trust you, and then they'll recommend it to a few more people. And that starts to grow exponentially. So one of the things I'd recommend in the early days is just to search out some local events around your subject. Even right now. Go to some virtual events, join some Slack groups, just start to get to know people in communities in your area, whether it's live events, whether it's online events, whether it's local communities, whether it's Slack communities, anything like that. Really contribute some value. Start to get to know people, start to answer their questions, and then your podcast content will naturally come up. And I think that's one of the best ways to get your show out there. There's tons more as well.
There's tons, yeah. And of course, if you're repurposing your live show into a podcast, you can talk about your podcast on your live show and try and get more of your live viewers to listen and subscribe your podcast. So I didn't actually know you just published a book. That's very exciting. What's the name of your book? Just highlight it on the screen.
Imaginatively called Podcast Growth. So I've gone for the Ron Seal approach. That's what it says in the tin.
That's great. So you can buy that from all good bookstores, as they say. Wonderful. We could talk for so much longer, and maybe we'll just have to have you back on because we could have talked so much more about the growth side of things. I know it's a big topic, but thank you so much, Colin. It's been great to have you on the show. So how can people find out more about you? There's the podcasthost.com. Is that the best place? And you've probably carelessly scattered yourself across all the socials as well. So how can people find out more about you?
I'm actually, the one I'm on the most, if you want to get in touch, is on Twitter. Yeah. So if you have any questions, happy to answer anytime. Just pop on to Twitter and get me on Colin MC Gray or our brand account. You can talk to our team at The Podcast Host as well. But yeah, thepodcasthost.com is where all our resources are. There's tons of free stuff on there. So if you're interested in mic reviews and presentation skills, growth, monetization, it's all there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Colin. It's been great to chat to you today. Thank you so much. Wow. That was amazing. Thank you so much, Colin. But I wanted to bring in Colin because he has just such rich knowledge of podcasting. And I hope you agree that was just so much amazing stuff there. You can listen back, you can watch the replay, and this will also be a blog as well. Also, get Colin's book. I didn't realize that Colin had actually written this book, but I ordered it straight after our conversation and it is amazing. So definitely check out if you're interested in growing your podcast. It's not specifically about live shows, but even if you're just looking at doing a live show, it's absolutely really good stuff in there. Definitely check that out. EDU Livestream says, what do you feel about Anchor? So actually Colin talked about Anchor and it's great in that it's free, but it does have some downsides. So if you're just starting out, if you're dabbling, then Anchor's good. Otherwise, use another tool. The one I particularly love is Captivate FM. It's such an amazing tool for hosting your podcast. So I think we're out of time. Well, we'll leave it there. So I really appreciate you all. Thank you so much. And I will see you next time. I really encourage you to launch your live show and your podcast with confidence. See you soon. Bye.
Thanks for watching the Podcaster Hour from Ecamm, helping entrepreneurs, business owners, and live streamers launch a podcast with success using the power of Ecamm Live. That's it for this week, but do tune in next time. See you soon and toodaloo!